Hi, I'm Miss Tyler. Welcome to Context for Kids, to our portion Key Tavo. It's laptop version because we're in the process of moving and selling the house, and so the studio's kind of not usable this week. Anyway, so like I said, this is Torah portion Key Tavo, starting in Deuteronomy 26. And Torah portion Key Tavo starts out with one of the most hated topics for grown-ups, because when you read about tithing in the Torah, there's obviously a couple of different things going on, and who's doing what, and what are we doing, and it's very confusing, but I'm going to make it easy for you, so you guys won't ever have to go, I don't understand tithing. I'm going to make it easy. So, let's start out first with, who were the Levites? Well, you know that Jacob, Abraham's grandson, had 12 sons himself. And the third son was Levi. But then something weird happens at the end of Genesis. Okay? And one of the sons, Joseph, you know, he was kidnapped and taken into slavery in Egypt. And then when he was down there, bad things happened to him. And then great things happened to him. And he ended up having two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Well, Jacob adopted Ephraim and Manasseh. And they got Jacob, or sorry, I was sick last week. They got Joseph's inheritance. So now there are 13 tribes. So 13 tribes came out of Egypt in the Exodus. But why do we always hear about 12 tribes? Because God took one of the tribes out and kind of took them out of the tribal system, made them a tribe unto himself. They became God's inheritance. God was the inheritance of the Levites, and I'll explain that to you. See, all the other 12 tribes, they got land inheritance. Now, we don't see that yet because we haven't studied that yet, but that's what we see at the end of Joshua. That the children of Israel had land. Land in those days meant you could raise crops and you could raise your livestock, and that is how you ate. And they weren't going down to the Piggly Wiggly. And whoever named a store Piggly Wiggly? I mean, I'm sure they're very successful. But that's just strange. Anyway, squirrel, let's get back to the topic. So, the Levites, God was their inheritance. They did special jobs for God. And it was given to them by a grant covenant forever. And grant covenant is what I call a good and faithful servant covenant. When God gives you a grant forever, it means that you have it, your children have it, your children's children, forever. Okay, God doesn't back out on his promises. I talk about this in my new book on the second to last week, because you got to know all the other covenants first. So I'm not going to go really deep into it, just you're going to have to accept this for now and study it later. Of course, I always tell you, study what I say. So the Levites couldn't have any land. So how are they going to eat? Well, God wanted all of his children to eat of the good land he'd prepared for them since, the beginning. Because this land was exceptional in the earth. It was an uncultivated land, which means, or it was a land flowing with milk and honey, which means that even uncultivated, which the Canaanites weren't cultivating it really. They had vineyards and all that kind of stuff, but they didn't have to work it because the land was so good. All right? Imagine what it was like when they started cultivating it later. It was amazing. And remember in Numbers, the 10 spies, they brought in a grapevine, or a cluster of grapes that was so big they had to suspend it in a bar between them. I don't know about you. That's a lot of grapes. That's really impressive. So, I would like to, never mind, we're not talking about what I'd like to eat. We're not going there. So, the Levites have a problem. Everybody else has land except for theirs, and they can raise grain and the crops, and they can raise vineyards and olive trees and animals, but the Levites, well, the animals that they raise, they're raising for the sacrifices. Okay? They're raising for this and that, and they've got fields and they've got flocks, but they don't really belong to them individually, they belong to the Lord. Okay? And they've got fields, so they can grow grain for the, the animals to eat. So how are the Levites going to eat? Well, very simple. There's the tithe, and God gave them the tithe as a grant. We're talking about grants. Grant is a gift forever. So, as long as the Israelites were in the land and they had their land inheritances, they were required to take 10% of that produce and give it to the Levites. But here's where it gets complicated, and this is where people get all crazy. All right, we run on a decade system. We think of years in terms of tens. We're living in the 2010s. Before then, we're the 2000s, the 1990s, 1980s, 1970s, and 1960s. Okay? And they went on before that, too. Surprising that, life existed before I was born. Me, the center of the universe. By the way, if you're wondering why I look like this, it's 4 o'clock in the morning. So if you're ever wondering what a supermodel looks like when she gets up in the morning, you still have no idea. Anyway, back to the story. So they ran on decades. Well, we run on decades, years of tens, but the Israelites ran on sevens. And they ran on a 7-year cycle. And they would count them first year, second year, third year, fourth year, fifth year, sixth year, seventh year. That's really important because they were only allowed to work the land for 6 years, and then on the 7th year, the land got a rest. So there was something called Maaser Rishon, Maaser Rishon, which means first tithe. And actually the Maaser part is the tithe. And the Rishon means first. So look, you learned some Hebrew today. Awesome. We'll learn more. There will be a test later. Yeah. Okay, so you got Maaser Rishon, the first tithe. And that was a straight up 10% of the grains, the grapes. So there were 7 species in the land. So we got the grains. We've got wheat, barley, pomegranates, olives, grapes. Oh, I can't remember what there were 7 species, just trust me. Okay. But those weren't the only things people tithed on, because anything they grew in the land, they would, leeks and onions and garlic, because, we know from the Exodus they can't do without their leeks and garlic. That was what they were complaining about. So all of those, everything that would grow in the land, they would tithe 10%. They would take 1 out of every 10 measures, and they would give it to the tribe of Levi. Okay? Now, they would do that, like I said, on year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, because on the 7th year, they wouldn't work the land. And you can't give a tithe of stuff that you're not growing. So the 7th year, no tithe. Tithe, first year, 6th year, 7th year. First year, 6th year. First, is 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th. It's 4 o'clock in the morning. I just proved it. Okay, so 6 years they tithe. The 7th year they wouldn't. And on the next year they would grow again. Okay, so it would go 6 and then 1, 6 and then 1, 6 and then 1. Remember that. So they would give that Maaser Rishon to the Levites, and that was 10% of everything that was grown in the land of Israel. Now the Levites would turn around and give 10% of their 10% to the sons of Aaron. And of course the Levites were a tribe set aside to assist the sons of Aaron, who were also Levites, but they were a special family that were in charge of the priesthood. Okay, they took care of everything in the temple, all the sacrifices, all the ministering to God. They were the ones that approached God physically. They had to have even more restrictions on their lives. The Levites just really weren't allowed to own land. Okay, but the priests, they had restrictions on who they could marry, just how they had to live. Things that probably you and I would not be very keen on, but they got to do things that were amazing. And so, everything has its trade-off. We're not priests, not Cohen, and so we get to marry who we want, within reason. So when the Levites would give their 10% of their 10%, that meant that the priests got 1% of the produce of Israel, and that was called the terumat hamaaser, the tithe of the tithe. Okay? Now, there's another tithe. But only the first one of those came from the Israelites, the maaser rishon, the first tithe. The terumat maaser was paid for by the Levites out of what they had gotten out of the maaser rishon. And remember, that was 6 years and then a year off. Can you hear my dog snoring? My animals, gosh. All right, so we've got another tithe. It's called the maaser sheni, and it's the second tithe. And the second tithe is actually broken down into two other tithes. Okay, the second tithe and the third tithe, but they're really the same tithe. The maaser sheni, the second tithe. Now this one is special. This one we really need to know our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And remember, again, on the 7th year, no tithe. On years 1 and 2 of the 7-year cycle, the people would take the second tenth. So they'd take another tenth after they took out their tenth, and they would go to the Feast of Sukkot. And they would eat it there. They would have a great feast over the 8 days of the Sukkot festival. So there were 7 days of Sukkot, and then there was Shemini Atzeret at the end. Okay, and they would do it was amazing. One of these days I'll teach you about those ceremonies, but not yet. I'm still learning. So they would eat it there over the course of the 8 days, and of course they would invite the poor to eat with them. All this, but this was a lot of food. This was a big feast. This was 10% of their crop, and they could sell some of it and buy whatever their heart desired, but they had to bring it. Maaser sheni, second tithe. So that was the first 2 years of the 7-year cycle. So years 1 and 2, you take it and eat it yourself. Okay? So 1 and 2 goes to you for the feast. Bad rhyme. Now the 3rd year of the 7-year cycle, that 10th would be stored up in their cities for the poor. So the poor would eat. And remember, the land produced so much food that the poor wouldn't go hungry. Okay? So the widows and the orphaned and the poor, the needy, the foreigner, the oppressed, they could eat if they were hungry. That's God's justice system. That's God's second tithe. Cool, huh? Okay, now, so we're at year 3. Year 3, put it away for poor. Year 1 and 2, you take it to the feasts and eat it in the presence of God. Year 3, and you could only eat it there in the presence of God, too. You couldn't take it elsewhere. You had to eat it there. Okay, year 3, you give it to the poor. Year 4 and 6, you take it to the feast again, just like year 1 and 2. So now we're on a 3-year cycle. Okay, so we're going to repeat it. Year 1 and 2, you take it to the feast and eat it. Year 3, you store it up in your cities for the poor. Year 4 and 5, you take it to the feasts and eat it there. And on year 6, you guessed it, you take your tithe and you store it up for the poor. I mean, the land was so good, it was producing more food than it could ever possibly need. Way more. And on the year 7, of course, you eat what you have stored up from your harvest in year 6, because there was so much. All right? So it really isn't that complicated. You've got your first tithe. First tithe all goes to the Levites. Then the Levites tithe to the priests. And then you got your second tithe, your maaser sheni. And they, first year, second year, eat it at the feasts, and you invite the poor and the widowed and the orphan, everything, to eat with you, that huge bounty that you got from celebrating with the Lord, because Sukkot was a harvest festival. And in the third year, you store it up for the poor, and you just, you're on your own for the festival. You just bring food, you just don't need to bring that much food. And then year 4 and 5 again, you take it and you celebrate a great, you eat a lot at the festival. I think you need the third year to recover from eating so much, year 1, 2, and 4 and 5, and then on year 6 again. And that's the year that you got the bumper crop. You're taking it and you're putting it in, and it'll be more than enough to last until the harvest starts again. And there would always be enough food. If they did this faithfully, there would always be enough food for the poor in the land, and always be enough food for the Levite who didn't have any land, and always be enough food for the priests who also didn't have any land. So that's tithing. It's really not that complicated. Now I'm going to, I'm going to try and make some kind of worksheet and post it so you can print it out on the blog this week. But first I got to get this uploaded. And so I hope that makes sense. I hope that takes the out of tithing. It's really kind of fun when you look at it in a 7-year cycle. Oh, and was Israel the only nation that practiced tithing? No. Do you remember back during the famine in Egypt, and Joseph was in charge of the land of Egypt? Well, what would happen, as if the people didn't store away their own grain, Joseph had them store away 1/5 of the grain to give to the storehouse cities. But I think they just ate the rest. They didn't store it up. And so by the end of the 7 years of famine, they'd already sold all their old land to Pharaoh. Now Pharaoh let them, after that, all the land in Egypt belonged to Pharaoh's family. Okay? And he let them be tenant farmers. He kind of rented the land back to the Egyptians. And they were on there as tenant farmers. Now they had to pay him 1/5. They had to pay him twice as much of a tithe as God was asking for. And there weren't nearly as many. They didn't have Levites. They had priests. But this was mostly going to Pharaoh. So Pharaoh got very, very wealthy. So, anyway, we see tithing, like I said, in other cultures. Egypt's the most obvious because we see it in the Bible. But tithing was it wasn't a new invention. It was just something that God used in order to feed. Oh, and we see that Abraham tithed to Melchizedek, the king of Salem, Jerusalem. So, there we go. Tithing. I hope it's not a big, great mystery anymore, and I hope you had fun, and I hope you learned a little bit of Hebrew. Anyway, I wanted to tell you, we've been praying for Isaac for the last year. I hope you remember. And we just found out this week that he's cancer-free. So, look at me. This is me. This is Miss Tyler crying. When you guys get sick, I cry. And when you guys get better, I cry even harder. So, anyway. All right. Stop, Tyler. All right. Anyway, I love you. And I'm praying for you. And I pray that you have a wonderful week studying the scriptures together as a family. Bye-bye.